Neither did I.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to this Sparrow session on work-life balance. So the way I'm Audrey Drodis, I'm a grad student in Michael Roberts Lab at the University of Michigan, and I'm going to be moderating the session. I'm also a Sparrow member. So how things are going to work today is I'm going to introduce our two guest speakers that we have with us today. I'll kind of ask a first general question about work-life balance, and then I'll open it up to everyone else here to ask questions if you would like. Feel free to ask, unmute and ask out loud. I think that might be the easiest, but if you're not able to do that for whatever reason, you can also put questions in the chat and I can read them out from there. Okay, so to get started, let me introduce our two guest speakers. So first today we have Dr. Angela Garinis, and she is a clinician scientist at Oregon Health and Science University and a principal investigator at the VA Portland Healthcare System's National Center for Rehabilitative Auditory Research. Her primary research interests are to improve ototoxicity management approaches for patients receiving known ototoxicants. Dr. Garinis has funding from the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. Her research program will support efforts to optimize metrics and surveys used in a comprehensive ototoxicity management program. And then our second speaker today is Dr. Melissa Caras. Dr. Melissa Caras received a BS in neuroscience with highest honors and a BS in biology at Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts. She then earned a PhD in neurobiology and behavior under the direction of Ed Rubel and Elliot Brenowitz at the University of Washington in Seattle, where she explored seasonal and hormonal influences on auditory physiology in wild-caught songbirds. After graduating, Melissa moved back east to pursue postdoctoral studies with Dan Saines at New York University, where she examined the effect of hearing loss on auditory development and the neural correlates of perceptual learning in adolescents and adults. Since joining the Department of Biology at the University of Maryland as an assistant professor in 2019, Melissa has continued this work recruiting trainees from diverse backgrounds to create a thriving collaborative group focused on rigorous hypothesis-driven science. Her lab uses a variety of optical and electrophysiological techniques coupled with a classical psychophysical approaches in Mongolian gerbils to uncover the neural basis for auditory expertise. Her work, which has been continuously funded by the NIDCD since she was a student, including T32, F31, F32, K99, and R01 funding, has implications for facilitating auditory learning in normal hearing listeners and for improving auditory skills negatively impacted by age or hearing loss. So first, thank you both so much for taking the time to be with us today. We really appreciate it. The first question that I want to ask is just to start by asking each of our mentors to share with us what's your sort of philosophy on achieving work-life balance, whatever that sort of means to you? And then also, how might these philosophies have changed from like when you were a student to when you were maybe a postdoc into being a professor? Maybe Melissa, do you want to start us off with that one?
So hoping you have Angie start, but I'll start.
Well, you can
Mainly
go
because
whatever.
I don't think I don't think I have a philosophy. And so I think I struggled actually like to formulate a concise answer to this question because there is no philosophy. It's just if you want to work-life balance, you just got to make it happen. That's like all there is to it. And so basically it boils down to just having really good time management and prioritizing and knowing like if you're juggling a lot of balls, knowing which of them is glass and which of them is rubber, and allowing the rubber ones to fall once in a while, keeping the glass ones up so that like things don't completely dissolve around you. But other than that, other than time management, being very efficient and thoughtful about how you're using your time and like what tasks you're saying yes to and what you're saying no to, and whether something is going to be worth your time and effort. I think that kind of sums up, if you would call it a philosophy of work-life balance.
And I can go ahead and jump in, Dr. Krause. Thank you. That's excellent advice. And the first thought that I had is that your work-life balance changes based on the stage of life that you're in. So when I was a graduate student and then a postdoc, things are very different before I had a family and children and so forth. And so my priorities were also different. And at that time, especially when you're early in your academic career, there is always going to be a lot of pressure in academia, and the urgency to say yes to everything is always there. And so it is important to step back and realize that you can't do everything, and to look at your opportunities and figure out where the deadlines fall. Because sometimes we say yes to things that are 6 months down the road, and then 8 deadlines all show up at the same time. And so that can be really stressful. And the reason I'm saying this is that time management and efficiency is really important, but also making sure that you're doing other things along with your work that are keeping you kind of in a good emotional and mental health state, so that you can enjoy life outside of just your academic career. So I definitely echo what Melissa said, and I do think that it's okay for your priorities to change, because that's just what life is. And you'll just start getting better at the efficiency and time management part as you continue your career. But if you could start early and figure it out, which I didn't until later, you make a lot of mistakes before you realize how to have boundaries and how to decide what activities to agree to. You'll be in a much better position early on. And so advocate for yourself, and realize it is okay to say no, even if you're just starting out in your academic career. Happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you both so much. Yeah, are there any questions from the audience that we can take at this point? Feel free to unmute or put it in the chat. Maybe while people are sort of thinking about that, one thing that I think, Melissa, you kind of touched on is like the glass versus rubber balls, which I think goes in line with this question of how do you kind of figure out that balance of like what is the critically important things versus what are not as critically important things, like how, in sort of prioritizing things as you maybe try to strike this balance. Either of you or both of you are welcome to touch on this.
Yeah, there's a really great diagram in this book, which if you don't have, you should all have, and it's free. There's a PDF online. It's put up by the HHMI called Making the Right Moves. It's a little outdated. I talk about like CD-ROMs or something at some point in there, and it's like, oh, that's quaint. But broadly, the advice in there I think is super valuable. And on one of the pages, it talks about basically every task can be urgent or not urgent. And it could be important or not important. And so those two things can interact in kind of like a Punnett square. And so if you're spending all of your time in the urgent and important box, it means you're in emergency mode all the time. Like you have a deadline that's due tomorrow and it's a super important deadline and you can't miss it. And that's a super stressful place to be. And if you're spending all of your time in the not important, not urgent box, then you're probably not being as efficient or judicial with your time as you probably should be. And so you want to be spending a lot of your time on the things that are important, but maybe less urgent. So like, for instance, right now, like what did I do today? I spent my time writing a grant. The grant is due in June, it's January. And I'm doing that partly because I will be going on maternity leave in May. And so I'm like, well, okay, then I have to get this grant in really in like April, theoretically, if I'm going to have a shot, but that still gives me several months of writing. But if I left it until like February, March, it's now starting to get more in that kind of urgent zone and like more stressful zone. So give yourself plenty of time. Figure out what are the things that really matter. Like this would fund my lab, right? Or provide additional funding for the lab. And so it's a super important thing. And therefore I'm going to spend a lot of time on it. Whereas something that's less important, I might say no to, or maybe leave to the last minute because it doesn't really matter as much.
Yeah, I would say that's great advice. Also, I think some of this perspective comes from the type of position that we have. And so I don't know, Melissa, do you teach routinely too, right?
I do, but
Okay.
yes, I have a teaching release this semester. So that's key also, like timing those releases for when they matter.
Right. And so I sometimes think about I started doing this, which reminds me, this is what I did in undergrad, where I'd say, what is the lowest grade I could get to pass my classes, but still stay afloat and get my degree? I don't function that way now in work, but what I typically do is say, what do I have to do that's priority in order, one, to maintain the position, and then everything above that is my choice based on how I want to utilize my time. So when you're in a soft money position like I am, most of your resources and your effort goes into research and writing grants and getting publications. Those are the key priority to keep your position going. And so everything above that, teaching, for example, admin or volunteer things, opportunities, are choices that you get to make. They're important, but you have to be able to decide what those are. Whereas, other people in academia have teaching obligations. And so that really does change how you are able to be efficient on your time. I have taught in the past, and it takes up a significant amount of time, and I love it. I just couldn't imagine doing it all right now. So that's a choice that I made. And so I think it's important to look at, how do we stay afloat in order for you to do the basics that are important for your position? And then like Dr. Caras said, then you kind of rank the other opportunities that you get. And is this interesting to me? Is this going to be valuable to my career? Will this build my CV? And if the answer to those are no, you might want to make a different decision, or, think about a different opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Those are both great answers. And I think along with that, so for a lot of what we just talked about, this is like kind of, when you're maybe a postdoc or, in a faculty position, you kind of make these decisions for yourself, mostly. Like, you get to decide what things you do and what things you don't do. Do you have any particular advice for maybe graduate students or people who are younger in their careers for working with maybe their mentors to help manage those workloads, or to help like have conversations about kind of, how much they're doing, or like work-life balance? So maybe people who, have these direct supervisors and need to like kind of manage this workload and what's critical and what's not with this other person.
I think you should go first, because I've taken the first go at the last few questions.
I mean, I think, it also depends on your mentor. So is your mentor organized? Are they time efficient? Are they, so there's things that they're going to pass down their strategies to you, and you want to utilize the strategies they have that have been effective. And so with my students and even with my lab, we tend to sit down on a routine basis, and we have open communication about the things that are or are not working. And I would highly encourage that. A lot of times, I think, PIs, mentors get so busy, we really we might miss the fact that someone's struggling. And so I think it's important for you to advocate for yourself and to set up a plan with your mentor, with the person that you're working with, to talk about this on a routine basis. And the other thing I would say, it doesn't hurt to talk to someone else, outside, that might help you develop those time management efficiency skills to make those choices. And so like a therapist, or someone that you trust, a friend that you can talk to, who you feel like's been successful in their, their own career.
Yeah, I mean, I think also there's like a myth in academia that the number of hours you work equates to, or maybe not just in academia, but just that the number of hours you work somehow equates to the your productivity level. And I think that's just nonsense. Since having my son, I do not work weekends. I rarely work nights. I'll work in the evenings if like he was ill and we had no childcare for a few days and I have to catch up, and that's kind of like a one-off situation. But most of the time, when I go home, I'm playing with him, I'm feeding him, I'm helping him go to sleep, and then I'm doing something for me, or I'm hanging out with my husband, like I'm doing something that is not work related. And on the weekends, it's like, I mean, it would be impossible to work anyways while chasing a toddler around. And so you learn to be just as efficient despite changes in life priorities. And so I'm still just as productive. I don't really know how, but I am. Like, you make it happen. And so, you can set up those boundaries. I mean, not all experiments are amenable to only working 9 to 5, of course. Sometimes you have to come in on weekends for a period of time. Sometimes you have to come in nights, depending on what you're doing. But you can balance that out with like coming in late the next morning, or like taking a Tuesday off, you know, and like it all kind of balances out. So I think, you know, being finding a mentor who's supportive and who has a work-life balance themselves makes it easier. If your PI does not have their own work-life balance, they're probably not going to be very amenable to these discussions, and that's where you have to go to outside help. But if you're choosing a mentor, try to find somebody who actually gets it, so that you don't end up in a situation where there's a mismatch of expectations.
Yeah, and I have to say, it sounds like you did a better job than me when I have twins, and I know Melissa has a toddler, and it sounds like, you know, yeah. So a question came into the chat. Audrey, is it okay if I read it?
Yeah, go for it.
Is I think most of us can relate to, and I've definitely struggled with in the past. So the question is, how do you handle having set expectations of being super productive from giving 110% at the beginning, but now have burnout and cannot maintain the productivity? Well, I will say that I've experienced this numerous times, you know, as a student and in my professional life in academia. And the times that I took a complete break, right? You have to step away from the situation completely, because you cannot recover from burnout if you keep moving in that same mindset while you're stressed out at work. And if you have enough space to step back, you'll really be able to see that, you know, some of the choices I know that I made contributed to the burnout, and it wasn't just the work itself. So like I said, over agreeing to too many things, doing things that maybe aren't really building your CV or advancing your academic career, feeling like you want to satisfy someone who's a senior because you don't want to upset them. That's a huge one for trainees, and something I've struggled with. And so I think, you know, there are plenty of choices that we make, and with little tweaks, you can try to avoid the amount of burnout. I can also say that I actually did work evenings quite a bit. And that's where the burnout came from. I actually would work, I put my twins to bed, and then I would work until midnight. And so I, you know, did this process exactly long enough where, you know, it's just not sustainable, right? We have to sleep. And those were choices that I made. And so once I decided I'm going to have boundaries, I'm going to stop at 5 or 6, and then whatever's not done will be done the next day, unless it's a complete drop dead deadline. You know, you stick to it, and it's doable. So realize that you have a lot more control over some of this than we typically think we do, because we're influenced and pressured. And that's where you reach out to people that you trust, maybe seniors in your field that you trust but aren't direct mentors, to get that advice.
Thank you.
I was just gonna, you're a hero, because twins terrifies me, like absolute horror.
They are terrifying.
It's amazing. But yeah, I mean, it all comes down to, I think, like, for me, it wasn't even a conscious choice. It was just really realizing that even if I tried to work at night, like, if I'm tired, like, the work that I produce isn't going to be very good anyways, and I'm gonna have to like redo it the next morning. And so I'm going to end up spending like 4 hours doing something I probably could have done in 45 minutes the next day after having relaxed and slept. And realizing that, I'm like, well, why would I waste my time? Like, I'll just do this tomorrow. And those emails that are piling up, I'll do later. Another thing that I think helps, that I haven't actually instituted until this past year, is as you move up the academic ladder, you find that more and more and more of your time is very easily filled up by things that have nothing to do with science. It's like a lot of bureaucracy and meetings and other things. And so what I started doing is just blocking off mornings. Like, so if it's a teaching semester for me, maybe 2 mornings a week. If it's a non-teaching semester, like right now, like every morning during the week from like 9 to 12, where I only do either reading, writing for a grant, writing for a paper, writing for one of my students' grants, or something science related, like I'm in the lab assisting with a surgery, or I'm in the lab assisting with like an experiment. So something that is like core science, reading, writing focus. And I treat it like it's a meeting, like with another person. And if I break it, I would be very rude to do that. And so I do not schedule things during that time unless it's like the only time my graduate student can have a committee meeting and all of the other people can meet, right? Like those are like rare exceptions, but 95% of the time it's a sacred time. I do not touch it. I just come in and I get to work. I turn off notifications. I do not answer emails during that time. I just work. And then in the afternoons, then I can switch to like answering emails or like taking care of all the other bureaucratic stuff that is kind of piled up from the morning. And I found that's been very helpful to actually let me have time to get stuff done that I want to get done.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. Again, advice I wish I followed early on. And now I do. You carve out the time that's necessary for you. I think that's really, really good advice.
So I think you both touched on this a little bit in your answers to that question, but kind of in talking a little bit about burnout, I just wanted to talk a little more about mental health. Like, are there other approaches that you use to sort of prioritize your mental health, in thinking about this sort of work-life balance, or other strategies that either of you have used sort of throughout the years, so that we can kind of avoid the burnout and also prioritize the things that are meaningful to us?
I have lots of suggestions. I myself am an anxious person when I have too much to do. And so I find that what tends to happen is when things pile up, instead of kind of finding a way to step back, it just kind of circles and you're overwhelmed. And so I actually took a mindfulness meditation class. It was a John Kabat-Zinn workshop for 6 weeks they offered here at OHSU. And so I think taking advantage of some things that for me, to be honest, initially wouldn't have taken the time to do, but I did find it helpful because it teaches you techniques to try to get out of your head and be able to look at what's stressing you out with more of a calm mind. So those are available. Most institutions actually have, I think, quite a bit for students now. As we said, there are therapists if you're interested that you can reach out to, or if you have someone close that you enjoy talking to, as well as absolutely physical activity. Exercise, I think, is key and really important. So keeping that in order to stay mentally and physically, balanced, regardless of what's going on in your life, make sure to keep yourself moving and take time for that. So I found that really helpful. I also, one other thing, I haven't been a naturally organized person, I think, throughout my life, but what I've done in those times where you feel burned out or overwhelmed, make sure on those days that you make a mini list of 2 to 3 accomplishments, whether they're small, that you think that you can accomplish for that day, and then leave everything else for the future day. So I think sometimes when we focus on things that are achievable, it kind of reduces the amount of stress, and then you keep moving forward in order to meet your goals and your milestones. So those are some strategies that have worked for me. I don't know if Dr. Caras has others that she finds more helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not naturally like a stressed out person, and I like I always have a to-do list, like a running to-do list, and so I'm constantly like checking things off, and it might be as minor as like write this person a letter of recommendation or write this grant, which will take like months, right? But I think again, things I've learned since having my son was like, for me at least, sleep above all else like is required. My son was not a great sleeper early on, and there were periods of time where I was just existing in like 30-minute blocks, and I like was craving just like a 2-hour block of sleep. Like one day I would get it again. And I realized like, I wanted to also exercise because that, like I wanted to kind of get back into shape, and I also wanted to like spend time with my hobbies, like reading books or like, going outside and going like bird watching or something. I don't know. And I realized I had to that like there were literally just not enough hours in the day for all of it. And I had to prioritize sleep. And I was like, exercise will come later. Once he's sleeping and I'm sleeping more, then I will get to do things like exercise. And it took a while. It took longer than I thought it would, but I had to like give myself the permission to be like, no, I'm just not going to exercise until I'm getting sufficient sleep. And then once I get sufficient sleep, then I can exercise. And then once I can do that, then I can add in like some of my other hobbies that I want to add in. And so it's been like a slow buildup. And now I know it'll all go away again, and I'm sure it'll come again soon. But that's okay, because now I'm kind of I'm prepared for it mentally. So I think giving yourself permission to like change the balance of your needs depending on your situation. Like in grad school, sleep was not as much of an issue for me because I didn't have like a baby screaming in the middle of the night. And so maybe it was like more like I was focused more on like making sure I got enough exercise or something. Like, and I do think exercise is key. Whatever your exercise that you'll do, it could be just walking. If that's your thing, like if that's the thing you'll do every day, do that. For me, it's yoga. So yeah, I mean, I don't meditate. I don't have any like mindfulness tricks. It's more just like figuring out what are the things that keep me sane, and then making a list of which ones are like the most critical, and then following that list.
Yeah, thank you both. Those are great answers. I'm sure very relevant to everyone at different career stages. So we talked also in that answer a little bit about kind of setting these like specific sort of boundaries about like when we're working and when we're kind of not working, and sort of, hours and things like that. Do you have advice for maybe people at varying career stages for like if maybe people aren't used to having set those boundaries or have never done it before, like how to go about kind of setting them up and then also like enforcing them, until that sort of becomes like a habit or something that, we're doing every day?
Again, I mean, I don't know. I'd say if you don't have work-life balance and you're trying to figure out how to implement boundaries, Google Calendars is pretty helpful. Like you could, I mean, I don't do this, but I know people who do. They literally block out every minute of their day. And so it's like, here's when I'm going to do emails. Here's when I'm going to have lunch with a friend. Here's when I'm going to work on this thing. Here's when I'm going to go to band practice. Here's when I'm going to have dinner with my boyfriend. Here's when I'm going to do X, right? And so like the fun stuff is on the calendar too. So it feels more official and like you have to do it because it's on your calendar. Another thing that could help is accountability from like a friend. So like in grad school, my friend and I would meet at the gym at 6 a.m., which is not something I would ever willingly or happily do by myself, because it's like dreadful. But if I know that my very, very, very good friend is waiting for me and I just like fail to show up, like who's the jerk in that situation? And so like I would drag myself out of bed, and it would always be worth it. Then I'd get exercise and I'd feel good that I did it. And I'm glad I prioritized it. But that was how I had to kind of like trick myself into going at that early. Otherwise I knew like, well, I'm going to be in lab until late because I had an experiment that would run late and I knew I'd be too tired to go to the gym after. And so if I didn't do it, it wasn't going to happen. And so finding ways to be accountable to what you actually want to do, like broadly, rather than like in the moment when you really just want to stay in bed or something, and scheduling things on your calendar and making them appear like a priority. And then maybe eventually you'll just kind of get in the habit of treating them like a priority.
I think those are good suggestions. There are a couple, I think of boundaries in different ways. So one is getting stuff done, and the other is how do you have set boundaries with the people you're working with, the students that you're working with. So not just for yourself. One example is, I can give a personal example of in my history, I've worked with some really amazing scientists and have, had instances where, like I was saying, I would continuously say yes on doing things and eventually get burned out because I wasn't setting a boundary of what is my own time management to be able to get something done. And I think the best way to do that is really to practice saying no, practice talking to people and communicating well for what you can and can't handle. Those are one of the boundaries I find with students that they have a very difficult time, especially with professors or more senior, staff indicating when they can't do something or they're not going to have the time to finish it. The second is knowing when to pull the plug when you have a deadline and you're just not going to meet it. There's a fine balance between doing a terrible job and meeting the deadline, and also, fully recognizing that it's not going to happen. And so those are things, again, that come with practice, but you can talk to your mentors and other senior academics that have been in those situations to get more advice on how to move forward. And with that said, for my own experience, those are two of the most, I think, stressful boundary making situations that, once I've gotten better at that over my career, have really reduced the amount of stress in just my professional life. So.
Yeah, thank you. I think we also have a question in the chat here, so I'll read it out. This is from George. They said, I've read/experienced the idea that science happens in bursts as far as productivity and results. How can we embody that, maybe temporarily removing boundaries without cycles of being overwhelmed?
Why don't you take this one first?
I was going to say it goes back to time management, because being overwhelmed and anxious is, has to do with how many things you have to get done at that time, or feeling like you're not going to accomplish something. So time management is extremely important. And you have to be okay with not solving an issue or having an answer within a certain period of time too. So if you're going to work on something, you have your limit on when you're doing the experiment, how much time you're willing to put in every day, and you allow it to be kind of free forming. Now, I'm a clinical scientist. I'm not a preclinical researcher. So Dr. Caras will have more input on the preclinical end. But I do know from what I've done on my patients and so forth, is it's okay not to be able to accomplish something in a short period of time if you're really trying to explore some clinical outcomes. And so it doesn't have to be, your primary project or idea. It could be something that you're working on in the background, and just to allow it to happen for new discovery. So, Dr. Caras, do you have any input on the preclinical end?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I really buy into the notion that science it happens in bursts, because I think what really is happening is you spend like 4 years troubleshooting all of these different techniques and trying to get stuff to work. And then suddenly there's a 2-week period where everything works and you collect all of your data for your dissertation. And it feels like that 2-week period is the burst. But really, there were like 4 years of like really hard work leading up to it that just felt like a slog. And without it, that 2-week period wouldn't have happened. However, I think it's good to be ready for that 2-week period. So when it does happen, like, if things are working and it's a really hard experiment, like technically, like, go for it, like collect the data before, something breaks. And I think one thing that can help is having, like, I'm a very goal-oriented person. Like I like accomplishing goals. And I find it rewarding to be like, okay, like I think it's helpful to have perspective. Like, why are you doing this thing every day? And so if the goal is you want this paper, you want to write up this paper and you want to publish it, then that burst period should feel very exciting, because that's when like everything's finally working and you're going to get the data you need for the paper. And so kind of thinking about it in those terms can help. The other thing I think is, at least for me, there are certain tasks that might require like a high activation energy, but once I get going, things really start to flow and I don't want to interrupt that. And for me, that's writing. It can sometimes take me a long time to get like the first sentence on a piece of paper, like a couple days. And then once I start like moving forward, then all I want to do is write. And for me, I have found that if I'm in that kind of zone, anything I can do to carve out time to let me just continue working, it's worth it, because I'm going to write way more efficiently and more effectively when I'm in that zone than if I like try to artificially schedule me writing at a time when like I'm like not really feeling it. So sometimes if I'm not really feeling the writing and I know that's something I have to do, I'll like switch to another task because I'm like, okay, it's not there yet. And then when I have that kind of burst of like creative energy or inspiration or whatever, that's when I kind of roll with it. I might drop some other tasks that I know I can be pushed off until later in the week because I want to get the writing on paper. I also found, I don't know if Dr. Garini experienced this, especially with twins, but I found that there was a period early on where like, you're just holding a newborn for like hours at a time. Like I nursed, and I would literally be stuck in chairs for hours. And I realized I could get really good at writing grants in my head. Like I could write an entire specific games page in my head, and I could jot down the key points on my phone. And then when I'd get to a computer, I could just like write out the entire thing, but it was like all there. But that took a lot of practice, but I had nothing else to do because I was just sitting around. And so finding ways to kind of make the burst happen, I guess, like kind of doing all of the legwork like mentally. And then so when you're at your computer, you can just like bust out like the writing that you need to do, for instance, can be helpful. But that was definitely a skill that like I did not ever anticipate having or plan to have. It just kind of happened out of necessity. So I guess also necessity is the mother of invention.
I was going to say mom mode is a thing that you don't really understand what it means until you're in it. I was wondering if, I don't know, George, if you're willing to kind of maybe describe if that's what you were referring to, or if there's a specific situation you wanted to share that maybe we could provide input on. Sorry to put you on the spot. Just thought it might be worth at least elaborating a bit.
No, I don't mind at all. I'll even turn on my camera. No, both answers were fantastic, especially as far as the finding the inspiration where you do have all of the ideas that you've been thinking about or troubleshooting for a long period of time that doesn't feel like progress, but actually is. And then it's just the part that's actually ink on paper where absolutely you sort of prioritize that because that is the culmination of the prior effort that you've put into it. So thank you both very much. That's really helpful.
I mean, that's why they call it a scientific process in general. And I've had to learn that some hard ways, where you put so much time in certain, portions of developing the aims, or, just ideas for the project. And it feels like you're wasting so much time on bad ideas. Okay. And they're not really bad ideas. They're things that you're actually utilizing to be able to focus more on what you want to do. And so, this is for someone who, struggles with how long sometimes the scientific process takes. It can be very rewarding in the end when you have those bursts. And I think, if you can try to be a bit more efficient on, again, where you're spending your time to focus your energy on some of the ideas you think might be fruitful. I mean, that's really the key,
Yeah, great. Thank you. Oh, Jarnell, did you want me to ask this question? I think you just sent in a DM to me, maybe.
You can skip it. I think Dr. Garinis already explained part of
Okay.
it.
That's good. Yeah, so another question that I had on my list that you both started to touch on now is especially thinking about managing workload and also life with children, whether you are a person who is having kids or is maybe supporting a partner who's having kids, or a similar situation. How did that sort of change? I mean, I know you've both touched on this a little bit, but how does this sort of change your balance, or do you have advice who are maybe for people who are going through this transition or thinking about going through this transition?
I mean, it's a big change, and it's super hard, and that's okay. It's it's up to you to decide what kind of parent you want to be, what kind of scientist you want to be, what kind of person you want to be. And for me, it's like I am a better mom because I have daycare. Like, because I am just not cut out to be a stay-at-home parent. That's just not my thing. I admire those who do it because that is a hard day to day. But finding what works for you and your partner or family or whatever you decide is working for you is the right answer. And it might look totally different than your friend. Babies are different. Some of them actually sleep Some of them apparently sleep in and you have to wake them up, which is like a completely exciting and novel thing that I'm hoping my second child will maybe like tap into, but my first has never. And so, you know, like babies are different, and people are different. Some people are morning people and they're happy to wake up early in the morning, and others are night people and they want to stay up at night with the baby. So like you gotta just kind of go with the flow. I have friends who their philosophy with just like rolling with the chaos of kids is like lower your expectations and then lower them again and it'll be fine. Like, and it's true. It's just like you just got to embrace the chaos, and sometimes like, you know, something will give, right? Like work might be fine and like the child is healthy and happy and your house is a mess. And you didn't get to exercise that day, or you got to exercise that day, but your kid didn't want to eat dinner and like it was a battle and it was super stressful, and work piled up. But like, you know, it in the end, it'll just all average out and it'll be fine. And you just have to kind of muddle through and like make it work day to day. Prioritizing only the things that are like key emergencies, like if necessary. Like it's okay sometimes to just have a day where you're just surviving the day. That's okay. Sometimes it's gonna happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I think about even in my PhD program, that was hard, and I didn't have kids. Like, I feel like life in general in different ways, in different stages can be hard, but as humans, we deal with it. So if you end up having children and you're raising children and you're both working, and the chaos that Melissa so beautifully described is totally normal. It doesn't even feel like survival mode. It's just your mode for a while. You're going to do it, and it's okay to let things go. That is one thing I think is really hard to learn. I hated the laundry being piled up. It drove me nuts before I had children. And now I start throwing it out because I don't feel like doing it because there's just too much. So, I mean, you change your perspective, and it's okay to let some things go and focus on what has to critically be done that day. So you have a deadline, you know, your family has to eat, the basics. And so when you learn how to prioritize what those things are, it does make things a bit easier to give yourself a break.
I should also add, I think it's really, really critical to have a support system. And so, you know, if you have a partner, like that partner, and you decide to have kids, that partner, you know, should be pulling their weight and helping with the children. If you are a single parent, like, you know, find a support structure, whether it's other family or friends or a mom's group or a dad's group or a neighborhood, whatever group, it doesn't matter. Like find that kind of support system, because I think without it, it can get like really overwhelming. But if you have a support group, either they're actually helping you with stuff, right? Like maybe they're helping with the laundry, or they're, you know, periodically babysitting or something. Or they're just kind of like letting you know that you're fine, like that everyone isn't like has other people have walked this road. What you just experienced today, which might have seemed new and super stressful for you, you know, a million other parents probably have experienced, and their kids are fine. And so if that, I think is critical. I think that's true also. Like, I think that's completely independent of having children, right? Like find your people, find your support group. It makes you feel less alone. And then you realize like everybody's probably felt like this at some point in their PhD, or everybody's probably been stressed out about X, Y, and Z at some point in their career. And then you kind of find out how other people dealt with it, or at least you just feel better because you're like, oh, I guess this is normal.
Yeah, and one other thing I'll add to that is, and this is regardless of your career, this, you know, as things get overwhelming, sometimes you're trying to multitask. And so, you know, I'm cooking dinner while I'm trying to watch my children, and also writing a grant. And you realize that none of those are getting great attention, right? So the grant's not going to do well, your kid's upset, and then you hear, you know, your spouse like, are you going to put the computer away eventually? So one thing that I also realize is you can take a step back and give respect to your partner, to your children, make them feel important, even if you're stressed out at work. And those are also hard lessons to learn when you have so much going on. But just take a step back and realize that, you know, all of your own stress, you know, other people experience in the house. And so if you can find ways to kind of shut the computer, give them focused time, You know, it's always better for everybody. And it's hard for us to remember that because I want to get things done really quickly. Otherwise I throw out my laundry. So
I like that. It's very relatable. Do we have any questions from the audience that people would like to ask? Maybe I should open it up for a couple minutes, or maybe for our speakers, are there questions that we haven't asked so far that you were kind of hoping to touch on during the session, or sort of anything that you feel like we should add on at this point before I dive into some other questions that I have banked here?
I mean, it would be helpful to know maybe what the, you know, the key concerns are. So even the top 3, you know, mentoring advice sessions that someone would like to have, and why, you know, why people would attend this type of spiral mentoring meeting. I think it'd be really helpful to know the people attending, you know, if we're touching on what's important to you, and if there's anything we're missing, to definitely let us know if we can answer questions.
Yeah, do people want to go ahead and maybe post in the chat like what or feel free to unmute too and
I think we have a question that just oh, maybe it wasn't a question. Somebody posted something in the chat
okay.
about learning and productivity. Cool.
Yeah, I don't know if people want to kind of sort of post in the chat where you're at, or maybe what were your concerns sort of coming into this session. Obviously I'm coming here because I'm moderating the session, but I also as a you know, a graduate student, I think it definitely during your PhD, maybe you come in with this idea of like, oh, I'm gonna be a PhD student, I'm gonna work, you know, constantly, I'm gonna like publish a Nature paper or whatever, and then like none of that is going to happen, of course, because I mean, maybe people do, obviously people do publish Nature papers, but you know, it's very different than maybe what you thought it was going to look like going in. I think that's a good you know, a good revelation to have, and also just you learn a lot about how to sort of strike that balance in grad school, and then also thinking about, you know, into the future, like, okay, what does a scientist really look like? Because a lot of the pictures that we paint are of or you know, that we see in the media are like the mad scientist who works all the time and doesn't want to do anything except read scientific papers and things like that, which is obviously not a realistic portrait of what most scientists look like, I don't think.
I think, you know, we're all multidimensional. Oh, good. Someone has a question. Hold on. How to handle the conversation when trying to hold your boundaries with your department chair or program director, and the power differential is stacked against you. I don't know what conversation is being referred to, so it's hard for me to know how to, like, I don't know exactly what the question is. Douglas, do you want to like elaborate? Like what kind of saying no? Oh, like if you're being asked to do something by your department chair and there's power differential, I'm like, how do you say no? I see. So I got some really good advice once from one of my previous mentors, and his advice was make sure to sign up for service related tasks that you actually find beneficial. So something like being on the admissions committee that might, you know, influence the students that come into the program that might work in your lab, right? Like that could be a direct benefit to you. Or that are relatively light workload, like maybe being on this seminar series, speaker committee. And then when you're asked to do something else, you can say, oh, well, I would love to, but I already committed to these other committees, these other service commitments. I can't, I'm sorry, I can't. So that's one kind of trick. Yeah, it's great, right? And so that's useful, because then it really does, like, you are doing service, but you're making sure you're doing the kind of service that is beneficial to you, or at least of interest to you, that you don't hate. So that's one way. Another way is to have, it depends on your chair, like if your chair is a supportive person, then you can kind of have a more candid conversation about like, here's what I'm currently committed to, you know, what is the actual workload for something like this? It might turn out that actually what they're asking has a relatively light workload and you don't even realize it. It might sound like it's going to be a lot more work. And if it's like, you know, you meet once a semester, like twice a semester, and it makes your chair really happy, maybe it's worth doing. Like maybe that's okay. But if it's going to be like the weekly meeting or something that's like a large time commitment, you know, maybe having the conversation about why you think it's too much of a time commitment at whatever stage you're in. Like maybe you're about to be putting in your first R01, or maybe you are teaching a big class for the first time. And so you're like, well, you know, I have these other things that are coming up and like I have these deadlines. So I don't think I'd, you know, have the bandwidth for something like this semester, but, you know, in a year, like I'll have more bandwidth and, you know, can I maybe postpone that till next year? So another thing is just kicking the can down the road can help. So it's kind of like a soft no, like not right now, but later. And then it maybe that mollifies them a bit. Those are the tricks I've learned. I don't know. What about you? Maybe.
I do those so regularly that I didn't even know they were tricks. I guess it's just something that you end up developing over time because, you know, the more you advance in your career, the more you're going to receive an email about reviewing a paper or giving a talk. And so you do have to pick and choose. I would say, especially with your chair and others you work with, you want to do it in kind of a tactful, soft way, like Melissa recommended. I would acknowledge and thank them for thinking of you with the opportunity. And in the background, think about why are they asking you to do it? Is it something they want to get off their plate or something that will actually help your career that they feel like will help you? And when I think about things in that way too, it's interesting because sometimes you realize, I mean, and I do this, I get so busy, I might ask a lab member or student, is this something you'd be interested in? I really can't do this. I don't have time for it. And so I think that trying to distinguish what the ask is really important. And then tactfully declining is good, but also tell them what's on your plate and how you're already being productive. And that I think people respect that. What you don't do and drives, I would say, most people crazy is ignoring them and not acknowledging it all. It doesn't ever go away when you do that. We have a mental post-it note. And so you don't want someone to have a mental post-it note because they felt like they were ignored. So I know it's hard to address things sometimes, but it's much better to handle it up front.
You should also, I mean, it depends on the stage of your career. I mean, that question I think was more geared towards like if you're already at like the faculty level and you're dealing with your chair. But another piece of advice I've gotten is that like the earlier you are in your career, the more the default answer can be yes to some degree, because you might be exploring opportunities. So like, for instance, when I was in grad school, someone asked me to participate in some kind of like AAAS policy event or something in Washington, D.C. And it was not something that ever crossed my radar, but I was like, okay, sure, like, I guess I'll try this. And I learned from that I absolutely hated it and that I would never go into scientific policy or politics or anything like that. And it was just like not for me, but that's valuable because then I at least was able to be like, well, yep, that's okay, cool. Like, at least I know that's definitely not the career path for me. Whereas later, like if someone asked me to do something like that now, I could be like, no, thank you, like not for me. So being willing to say yes, or like to be open to more opportunities or things early in your career, again, balancing like time, right? Like you want to say yes to everything, but being more open and willing, I'd say like earlier is fine. And then as you advance in your career, you can kind of get more and more selective and judicial because your time also it becomes more and more kind of carved out because you have like more and more and more demands on that time.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have any more questions? And I know, Dr. Caras, you have to head out at some point too, so don't let us hold you. All right, so we also have another question here. Do you think, right, this hasn't been asked. So do you think work-life balance depends on financial situation? In many cases, the earning is less in academia in comparison to industry. Any suggestions on how to manage or say survive in academia? So I think maybe this question is asking like specifically, maybe if you have a better financial setup in, say, an industry position, maybe you can offload some financial concerns that maybe help with work-life balance. Is that maybe what this person was asking?
Yeah, I mean, I think I understand the question, and I would say any type of financial stress is going to be stressful. I mean, regardless. And so many of us in academia know that we probably could go to industry and make more money. I mean, that's just the way it works, but the job might not be as reliable, and you won't have the freedom of thought to write grants and do the work you might want to do. And so I know plenty of people who get their PhD that have, they go back and forth all the time, and some actually try industry and then they go back into academia and vice versa. And, in some ways, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think having experiences that, lead you to maybe make a better career choice for what works for you is just fine. However, when there is financial stress, depending on how many loans you have, how much, how many kids you have, being able to afford your bills, some people will skip academia and postdocs altogether to go into industry. And that, especially the postdoc, I think has been a big issue for academia. We need to up our postdoc salaries. So I can understand that. I think it's a hard question to answer. Would you rather make an industry choice versus academia because of it? And I think it really comes down to that person's priorities and what your interests are, and also what your standard of living are. If you have a really expensive habits, that's obviously going to make it a bit harder to have an academic salary that might not be able to support them. So focus on your priorities and what would make you happy in life.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question, I feel like there are kind of like two things kind of like mixed in here. So like, okay, if you have like financial insecurity, does that affect work-life balance? Sure, because then all of your free time might be devoted to like a second job, or it just like adds a whole other level of stress. And like, yeah, like I could see how that would affect it. But if like once your minimum needs are met, like you have food, you have clothing, you have shelter, and you're not scrounging from month to month for it, like you're like, okay. And you can have that in academia just fine, or in industry just fine. Like, would I make more money in industry? Sure. But would I have the flexibility of schedule that I have in academia? No. And so there are trade-offs, right? Like I could make probably a whole bunch more money. But if my kid was sick, I couldn't just leave. I'd have to take a sick day. I'd have to like tell someone I was going somewhere. Whereas in academia, like if I get a call and my kid is sick and I have to go pick him up at daycare, like I'm like out the door. Like there's no one to be like, oh, I gotta go, bye. And no one cares. Like they know that I'm gonna get my stuff done and it's fine. I can, it's all it's self-directed, right? And that's where it's like, oh, okay, well, I'll just make up like the things I was doing. I'll just like do it tonight after he goes to bed. Whereas in industry, you might not be able to do that. Maybe like you had to be at some meeting and there was no other option or something. So I'd say there's trade-offs. So like industry could be worse for your work-life balance in that regard, maybe less flexible vacations. You have like, again, like vacation time. You have to tell people when you're leaving and ask them permission maybe. Whereas in academia, I just go whenever I want. So once you're above you are financially secure level, then I'd say, no, it just kind of depends on what you want out of life. Like there's something perfectly fine about going into industry, perfectly fine about going into academia. There are trade-offs for both, but both are great. Below that, yes, of course, like there's going to be an impact on work-life balance and just general well-being. But I think that's just true with like all socioeconomic hardship.
Yeah, and I would also say make sure that depending on what your academic position is, that it's competitive and comparable to others that are at your institution in your similar position too, because sometimes and even some people that I've worked with, you don't realize there is sometimes an imbalance, and you have to advocate for yourself getting a raise if it's possible. So there's ways once you actually get into an academic job, and I'm not speaking about the postdoc. The postdoc salary, I think, is absolutely still an issue for many people to even make ends meet in big cities where 40,000-50,000 does not go far. But for a standard academic career, I think that you can actually do fairly well. And it comes down to your priorities and, what your spending habits are. But I think I know what Melissa said. She hit the nail on the head. My friends that are in industry, there's very little flexibility in their schedules, and the stress is sometimes worse. And again, the security in the position, I mean, in industry, they might be able to cut you that week and you had no idea they were laying you off. Whereas you build up an academic career and have your reputation, it's much harder to do. So.
Yeah, and I think Melissa put a good comment in the chat too, that NIH has a loan repayment program, which you can apply for, and they can pay for your student loans over a period of years, which is really useful and you can apply at any career stage, I believe, also grad student, postdoc.
You have to have your terminal degree, so you cannot
Oh,
apply
right.
as a grad student, but you can apply as soon as you get your PhD, AUD, nursing, doc, whatever your terminal degree is.
Okay. Yeah, so that is a super great program that NIH has. Are there any other questions for the speakers? I guess I have another kind of question as did you have, sorry, Melissa, I saw you
I was
unmuted.
gonna say I'm gonna have to run in like literally a minute. So as you're talking, I'm going to be putting on my coat and I'm multitasking.
Okay. Sounds great. Yeah, well, thank you so much for spending the time to be with us today. We really appreciate it. One question I was kind of thinking about is since our speakers, and Angela, you can kind of take this one, but have some perspective. You talked about the postdoc salaries being kind of an issue. Are there other things in academia that you think could be changed to kind of help people have more positive work-life balance, or in your experience having been in the field for a while, what are some other things you've noticed or that you think could sort of be worked on in that regard?
So, again, this is extra work from what your primary position might be. But when I was a postdoc, I also did compensation and pen for veterans. I'm an audiologist, and so I was able to do some clinical work on the side. And it wasn't just for the need of more money. It was more to keep my clinical skills up, which, even a 2-3 year postdoc can kind of limit. For us, it's hearing amplification. So things change so rapidly. I wanted to make sure to stay in the loop. So those are some opportunities to get more experience, and also maybe up your salary a bit, bring in more money. The other is, even as if you're in a postdoc position, you're still an expert in your field, and you can do some consulting at that point. And so you can look into industry opportunities. I have done some industry and even legal opportunities for consulting funds that I thought were interesting. And those are ways that you can kind of supplement the postdoc salary. Other than that, I would say mind your spending. I didn't have children. Remember I was making 40 grand when I was at the University of Washington, and that was my NIH postdoc funds for 3 years in Seattle. So I had a very simple lifestyle, and most of the things I did for fun didn't cost a ton of money because I was in the Seattle area and I could go outside. So those are kind of things I would focus on. But I would say that if you can find some extra opportunities that might still help build your CV, bring in a little extra money, but will be valuable to you, those options are out there.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions from the chat here? People who are here who would like to kind of ask a question? Okay, if not, I'm happy to end a couple minutes early unless anyone has any burning questions that they would sort of like to ask here. I've asked all the questions on my list, so
And I'm happy
well,
to answer any questions over email if something comes up, if that's helpful. So I'm available even after this if it would be useful to someone.
okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Well, yeah, thank you so much for chatting with us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you to Arrow for setting this up, and thank you to everyone who came today and listened and asked questions. We really appreciate it, and we'll look forward to hopefully seeing you all at Arrow this year. Yeah, so I think with that,
Thank you.
stay healthy, and yeah, we'll see you all around.
Thanks, Audrey. Thanks for the opportunity. Have a great day, everyone.
Yeah, bye.